Here's a question. That 5800X doesn't come with a cooler, so what's the best air cooler for it? If you want to go all out, these dual towers are a good place to start. When properly configured, a lot of these coolers are pretty competitive against a 280 all-in-one liquid cooler, but which one's the best? Welcome to Machines and More. Well, here is the Ryzen CPU I almost didn't want to get because it seemed like such an oddly placed and priced CPU. And maybe that's why it's one of the easier 5000 series CPUs to find in stock lately. But whether or not you should get this chip will be the topic of a future review. So go ahead and click subscribe and that bell to be a part of the channel to get updates on future content. The 5800X is actually an awesome CPU for both gaming and productivity, and if you pick it up, I think you'll be really happy with it. But there's one aspect of ownership that's a bit different with this Ryzen 7 chip compared to the 3700X or 3800X of yesteryear. The clock frequencies are much higher, but it's actually a bit more challenging to cool. The TDP spec for this chip is at 105 watts, which is equivalent to the Ryzen 3900X and also the 5900X. So to answer the question of what air cooler to get for the CPU, today let's take a look at a few dual towers to see how they fare with the 5800X. For this comparison, we're going to take a look at 5 coolers again, and I think to get the most out of this chip, you really want to look at either liquid cooling or a dual tower. The conventionalism with Zen 2 and onwards was run the CPU on PBO and just give it as much cooling as you can. Certainly I think that's great advice, but I don't think you have to break the bank to cool the 5800X. So I'll structure the review this way. I'll kind of talk about the coolers at a high level, then we'll just look at the key differences and dive into the thermal testing results. I'll give a few recommendations, and I'll explain towards the end of the video why you may or may not want to bother with choosing a good cooler. And I'm sure if you've watched this far into this video, you do at least care somewhat. So dual tower air coolers are just that, a CPU cooler that's split into 2 towers, and each tower has its own fan, typically to exchange off the heat. Now some dual tower coolers have just a fan in the middle, but all of these that we're looking at today have 2 fans equipped, at least. So these coolers all feature dual loop heat pipes. So each heat pipe makes a U shape through the base plate. You can see it comes from one side to the other, and they terminate at the top of the tower. When we look at an air cooler, there's a few factors that contribute to how well it will perform. The first is the heatsink itself. The better the heatsink is at drawing heat away from the CPU, and the more thermal energy it can store at any given point in time, the better it will perform. Now, good thermal transfer comes from a well-designed base plate on the bottom, and also it depends on the heat pipes, right? For which quantity and quality both matter. How much thermal energy this cooler can hold also comes down to material. And since these are both a combination of aluminum and copper, we can generalize by simply weighing the heatsink. Lastly, how good the cooler is at venting off its heat is of huge importance as well. And for that, it comes down to the design of the heat fin, so the spacing as well as the shape of the heat fins, and also the quality of the fans. The more air that you can move through the heatsink, the more heat you can dissipate from the heatsink, and that will result in better temperatures. A good cooler combines all of these into a package that is as compact as possible for maximum compatibility. So first off is the new Cooler Master MA624 Stealth. We also have the Noctua D15 Chromax, the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4, the new-ish ID Cooling SE207XT.black, and finally the Scythe Fuma 2, which we've also tested on this channel before. So to kick things off, the MA624 is the new Cooler Master dual tower offering. This is a massive cooler at about 965 grams of heatsink weight. Top of this cooler gets it to roughly 162.5 millimeters off the surface of the CPU. 3 fans are included. You got 240 millimeter fans here and one 120 sickle flow fan. With 2 of these 140 fans installed, and even with a 34 millimeter RAM, you're looking at this RAM side fan getting pushed out a lot. And that's at least 168 millimeters high. But the intent with this cooler is that if you have a clearance limitation, you just run the 120 sickle flow instead, which gets it down closer to 164 millimeters kitted out that way. Certainly if you have the space, and that's how I tested it, you could mount all three. This middle fan is pretty interesting, and it's not easy to remove it. It's latched in place by the heatsink cover, which is also difficult to remove. It's a great fan mounting design. There's no clips to mess with. These plastic clips are pretty elegant. 6 heat pipes, nickel plated base plate with a micro machine surface, black finish. With the exception of this heatsink cover, it looks and is priced pretty similarly to the Noctua D15 Chromax at $100. Now this Noctua D15 in Chromax.black, and you probably think D15 when you hear dual tower cooler, and it is the heaviest heatsink at about 986 grams, so nearly a kilogram of metal here. It's uncanny how close these two coolers are. They both feature 140 millimeter fans with 120 millimeter holes. Now the tallest point of this heatsink is around 161 millimeters, but the height of your RAM will influence the clearance of this fan too. So even with 34 millimeter RAM, it's about 167 millimeters, so very similar to the Cooler Master unit. Also 6 heat pipes, nickel plated machine base plate. Recently this cooler was priced at $100, but it's seen a bit of a price hike on some Noctua goodies lately. You might see this for $110 when this video is released, so I have no idea if that's a permanent price change or just a fluctuation, so just be aware of that. Next up is the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4. This one is also a very popular big tower. 890 grams of German designed heatsink goodness here. A bit of a different fan configuration with a 120 millimeter and a 135 millimeter silent wings fan. Unlike the other two coolers, this RAM side fan is a 120, and you typically want to stick to RAM less than 40 millimeters high, and that would mean that the highest point of this cooler is about 163 millimeters tall at the top of the heatsink cover. Black finish, 7 heat pipes, micro machined nickel base plate. This is a good looking $90 cooler with a stealthy top cover. Love it. ID Cooling's SE207XT is a recent release. It looks a lot more subdued compared to this competition, and it happens to be more budget friendly though, at around $70 when I checked. It's got 7 heat pipes, and this is the only non-plated bare copper base plate in the roundup. 220 millimeter stock fans, offers great compatibility. I measured 158 millimeters, and it's spec'd at 157, but you do have a RAM side limitation, so you will need to stay under 38 or 39 millimeters of RAM height in order to maintain this overall height. Not the best, but decent build quality. 882 grams of heatsink weight. The fans are definitely of the more budget variety compared to what was stock. On the SE224 XT, they appear to be the same fan. Thin plastic. Last in the official roundup is the Scythe Fuma 2. Now, even though this cooler is of the dual tower variety, it's a little bit different. It's the only non-symmetrical cooler in our comparison. It's shifted off to one side to allow for practically no interference from the RAM. It's notched out heavily on the other side if you have RAM on both sides of the CPU socket as well, so it makes accommodations for that. 750 grams, nickel-plated smooth polished base plate. The lowest priced cooler in the comparison at $60 market price currently. This one is compatibility oriented with a low height of 156 millimeters that I measured, even though it's spec'd at 154.5. And as such, it's a good choice for smaller cases like the NR200. Because of its design, the cooler purposely uses a slim 120 and a 25 millimeter thick 120 millimeter fan in the middle. They spin in opposite directions by design, but they still move air in the same direction. And these Kaze Flex fans are unfortunately limited to 1200 RPM, which is arguably its biggest limitation. Now, it might seem unfair to include this one, and it's definitely at a disadvantage, but I'm including this one here because some folks have a case with a height limit that this satisfies, and it will also illustrate what kind of trade-off exists when compatibility is a priority, and why a good cooler is really important for a chip like the 5800X. Mounting methods are all similar across the board for these, but there are a few exceptions. In general, these feature mounting bars that attach to a backplate. Four of these use the stock AM4 backplate and come with an Intel backplate, but the Cooler Master unit kind of uses its own plastic backplate. It's a combo Intel AMD backplate. Kind of inconvenient, but it's not terrible. These coolers will then just feature screws or nuts that mount to the mounting bars, but the Cooler Master has a very unique system here. Instead of having to stick a screwdriver into a screw slot close to the base, it features an elongated screw and that tops out at the cover, and you would just use a screwdriver right here. Pretty neat. And the Be Quiet unit uses a removable bar with screws that can be freely removed. You will have to place this bar onto the grooves above the base plate and then tighten down. It's a little bit inconvenient, but not the end of the world. All these coolers come with a splitter cable to allow you to connect all the fans together. The Cooler Master, even though it does come with 3 fans, is spec'd with a 2-way splitter. I did have a 3-way splitter handy so I could connect all 3 fans together. They all come with thermal paste for mounting the cooler to the CPU. Small tube, big tube, some of these are bigger than others. And the smallest tube is the Be Quiet one, which has enough for about 2 mounts. Each of these have fan clips that mount the fan to the heatsink. The Cooler Master probably has the nicest ones because it has these big plastic clips and really easy to wrangle onto the heatsink, no fuss. The Be Quiet is the odd one out. Now this clip is straight at the heatsink end, and it's really hard to hook the clip over the heatsink. Rather, it's a bit easier to install the clip first at the heatsink and then pull the open end of the clip onto the fan. So with that comparison complete, let's get into the thermal results. A quick rundown on the system. I'm testing Blender's Pavilion render with an open O11 Mini to avoid any case-induced interaction between the coolers. And these are all tested with the same CPU and the same motherboard, the Asus B550i-TX that was recently reviewed on the channel. An RTX 3080 Founders Edition card is installed, but the fan is idling because the card is not at load. And for the thermal comparison, I'm testing with a locked core frequency of 4.7 gigahertz on all cores and 1.325 volts for an apples-to-apples comparison across CPUs. From my experience with this chip, that's a good all-core clock to shoot for with these bigger coolers. And even though with the Ryzen 5000, I would recommend gaming and general use with a curve optimizer profile, it's also a good idea to set up an all-core profile with a fixed voltage within Ryzen Master if you know you're going to be doing an all-core CPU-based render. And certainly this is a more objective way to compare thermals. All of these cooler fans were normalized to a target system noise level of 2 decibels above the noise floor, which, based on how these coolers perform, is a reasonable level to limit your cooler to, and considering that you should be able to hit suitable boost clocks at this level with all these coolers. Unfortunately for the Fuma 2, it was not able to hold that clock in the voltage since the fans top out at about 1.2 decibels above the noise floor. And although they are spec'd to 1200 RPM max, they only hit about 1150, at least these do. I did a comparison with the stock fans that I will share shortly, but for this first comparison, I did have to swap in the new Scythe Fuma black fans to get a completed render. So jumping into the comparison, we can see how the coolers behave throughout the roughly 7-minute render, which has a characteristic spike at the end. Clearly the Fuma 2, even with help from the upgraded fans, finishes with an equilibrium temp of roughly 77 degrees before that spike. The 3 coolers are remarkably tight. In fact, the D15, the MA624, and the SE207 all settle in between 73.5 and 74.5, with the ID cooling unit coming in 4th, the Cooler Master in 3rd, and the D15 in 2nd. And the Dark Rock Pro 4 is the winner, hitting equilibrium of about 72.5 degrees. And I threw in a fun wild card here just as an illustration as to why you'd even want to run such a big air cooler with this CPU. As good as the single tower SE224XT was with the 5600X, it's not exactly a silver bullet for the 5800X, and even with an upgraded Noctua fan running at a loud level at its max fan speed, these dual tower coolers are clearly out of its league. So what's the justification for caring about the thermals at all? Well, if you run the 5800X with a moderate curve optimizer setting of -15, and this is highly silicon dependent. A stock Fuma 2 with fans running at max will net you a sustained all-core clock of about 4600 megahertz. Not too shabby, but when you consider that the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 gets you about 100 megahertz higher, there's your obvious performance trade-off. So the better your thermals, the higher clocks your chips will boost to, in addition to having a more stable system overall. So for the most part, with the exception of the stock Fuma 2, you're going to see a high level of performance with the 5800X for all these coolers, despite the small differences here. To do a quick summary and recommendation, the Fuma 2's compatibility with thinner cases and allowance for RAM does come at a price, and the stock fans aren't exactly a winning combination. Still though, if this is the most cooler that you can get in your case, 100 megahertz at an all-core frequency is not the end of the world necessarily, but it is a trade-off nonetheless. I do wish to see this released with higher speed fans, as I think that is a really quick remedy to make this cooler a lot more competitive. Then the user could upgrade fans right here, like I tested, but at the same time, that puts this cooler into Dark Rock Pro 4 pricing territory. The ID Cooling SE207XT is impressive. It makes really good use of just 220mm fans, and you know, this will be able to fit in the NR200 with a vented panel, since I did measure it in at shorter than the Noctua U12A. RAM dependent, of course. It's a little bit budget looking. The plastic top plate here is and the thinner plastic on the fan blades is in some sense expected with its price. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not presenting a noise comparison at the noise normalized level for all of these coolers, since the sound is pretty similar, but this fan did have a little bit of whine, and I will present that here. It's not the worst sound, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Certainly if performance is your goal, it gets way too close to the D15, which is priced much higher. Cooler Master's MA624 is certainly a worthy competitor, and as some say, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. Now, I don't know that flattering Noctua is the goal here, but man, these coolers are just so similar looking. Pricing is reasonable given that you are getting 3 fans, but some of us can't fit or need 3 fans. And if you're running taller RAM than one of these 140mm fans is no-go anyway. So the problem with packaging a cooler this way is that it narrows the market a lot. With all 3 fans, it works remarkably well, and if you can mount them all, it's a really good buy. Otherwise, you're just paying for something you can't use. My final observation with this cooler is that unfortunately it's not easy to switch fan orientation with this cooler. If you want to run rear exhaust, you mount it like this, right? But you can't just flip this middle fan around if you want to run rear intake, which kind of is the best way to go with these flow-through GPU cooler designs. You essentially have to flip the entire cooler, and now the logo is upside down. It's not really the most elegant design, even though I really like this mounting mechanism and the sleek cover plate. Indeed, Noctua's D15 proves that it is a stalwart in the realm of dual towers. As one of the most expensive coolers in this comparison, it certainly performs well, and fit and finish are hallmarks of Noctua products. And I would say the installation is the most straightforward out of all these coolers. These D15 fans aren't exactly the strongest fans out there. They aren't bad, but kind of share their position with other brands, as opposed to Noctua's phenomenal A12x25s, which are well ahead of the pack. Compatibility, because of this big fan, is also a factor to consider. With taller RAM, just like the MA624, this fan quickly gets pushed up and your required clearances jump. All around, this is a really, really good cooler, but for me, this one is still highly price dependent. So that leaves one cooler, right? The Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 is always brought up as a competitor against the D15, and in this round, it's the winner. It has a few quirks. The cooler and fan mounting is awkward. The bottom of the fins are open, so in certain setups, it is more prone to interference from GPUs, but still on a pure CPU thermals basis, this one absolutely wins, and for me, it strikes an excellent balance of clearance height, build quality, appearance, price, and of course, performance. That the fans are limited to 1200 and 1500 RPM for the 135mm and 120mm fans respectively means that you have limited headroom, but here we're specifically looking at the 5800X, and I think you have enough just for that chip. Since all these fans feature a 120mm fan mount pattern, you can upgrade the fans fairly easily if you want, and for the few bucks you save over the Noctua D15 or the MA624, you could mount a third 120mm fan in the back of your case, and well, I think at that point it's a knockout punch. Stock out of the box, is it a clear performance standout in a crowded field? No, but no other cooler compared here manages to hit that delicate balance of so many factors, and I think for that reason alone, this one deserves serious consideration for your 5800X build, assuming you can fit it, of course. So that will do it for this roundup. It's always fun checking out how these coolers behave with different CPUs, and if you like this sort of stuff, please subscribe. And I'm leaving product links for the coolers down below. Feel free to check them out, support the channel. Thanks for sticking with me here, and I'll see you again soon.